Feudalism, the kind of society where there are unequal rights and unequal legal protection for common people and the nobility. The kind of society that is dominated by small and powerful elite groups, and where the relationship between rich and poor is lordship and serfdom. Does it sound familiar? Some argued that we are now returning back to this kind of society, popularly being referred to as New Feudalism. After the financial crisis of 2008, American technology billionaire Nick Horner stated that the United States is rapidly becoming less a capitalist society and more a feudal one. But are we merely just returning back to normal? Are these kind of unequal societies just the norm? Stanford University professor Walter Schiedel argues that this is the case in an article published by the Washington Post in 2017. Historically, most societies have gradually grown more unequal over time, and whenever inequalities have been leveled out, they are almost always done so by violent forces such as war, revolution, or plague. For most of human history, inequality was either rising or on stable high levels, and it is rare for inequality to significantly fall. Historically, societies have developed institutions, laws, and customs that govern ownership of goods, private property rights, and inheritance rights, which has allowed for the elite to pass wealth from one generation to another. And if you wait long enough, that will almost automatically lead to rising inequality. Governments often reinforce the trend towards greater inequality in income, and the upper class are usually closely allied to those in power and gain an unfair advantage. We saw an unusually large drop in inequality during World War I and II, and this has shaped people's perception of what inequality looks like, where the post-war period of the 50s, 60s, and 70s have become the reference point. In that time period, economic growth was strong, the middle class was expanding, and inequality was low by current standards. But ever since the 1980s, growth has slowed, and what growth we have disproportionately benefits the people at the top of the income distribution. Professor Schiedel explains that there are so-called great levelers that have historically caused lower levels of inequality. The following graph depicts historical data of inequality in Europe, and you can see that there are three major episodes in European history where inequality fell. Around 500 CE, the Roman Empire fell. The ruling class was undermined and disappeared, and so did the inequality they reinforced. This was then followed by the plague. In the 14th and 15th centuries, the Black Death killed off a large percentage of the population, leaving the same amount of land and capital, but with fewer workers. This increased the demand for labor, causing wages to rise. This leveler, however, only lasted for as long as the plague was active. When population growth resumed, the demand for labor went down and inequality rose again. Between 1913 and 1945, Western countries experienced the Great Compression, caused by mass mobilization warfare for World War I and II. To raise funds for the war, the government raised taxes to extremely high levels, and in many countries the war caused massive physical destructions of capital, housing stock, and factories, causing the rich to lose a great deal. At the same time, unskilled workers were better off and their labor was in more demand, driving up their wages. Interesting to note is that before the Great Compression, inequality in many places, such as Europe and US, was the highest it has ever been. According to Professor Schiedel, it doesn't seem realistic to hope for the kind of equality we saw a generation ago. That improvement is unlikely to happen without paying a very high price in the form of a major violent or unpleasant event. Due to technological advancements, it is tempting to think that things are different now, that maybe equality could be leveled using peaceful methods such as democracy, education, and land reform. But Professor Schiedel argues that these methods aren't nearly as effective as the violent great levelers of history. People after World War II had industrialized economies for the first time, full democracy, and mass education, so it was reasonable for them to assume that the high inequality would never return, but this turned out to be untrue, because other forces reasserted themselves. Last year, the following tweet gained lots of attention. It was tweeted by the American entrepreneur Don Price, co-founder and the former CEO of the credit card processing company Gravity Payments. He refers to data on workers losing $3.7 trillion in the pandemic, while billionaires gained $3.9 trillion. He calls this the biggest one-year wealth transfer in history. Since this tweet, there has been war, sluggish markets, and a prolonged pandemic. According to Forbes' annual ranking of the richest people on the planet, all these factors hit the billionaires of the world, and their total net worth dropped with $400 billion this year. The put it in perspective, here's a graph showing billionaires' net worth over time. In the annual Forbes list of the world's billionaires in 2020, in the early stages of the pandemic, the world billionaires had a total net worth of $8 trillion. Compared to this year of 2022, they had a combined worth of $12.7 trillion. It is safe to say that even with war and economic downturn, the world's billionaires have increased their total wealth during the pandemic.